Please join me in a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, and fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in us the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and we shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Chapter 11, a century of suffering, plague, war, and schisms. So, in this chapter, we're coming out of the 13th century, and in the 13th century, the church had done some great work under the pontificates of Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, Gregory IX, who reigned 1227 to 1241, and Boniface VII, 1294 to 1303. And they had established the church as a leader in both the ecclesial realm and the temporal realm, and that the church had an impact in the secular world. Yet she had found her right order in that realm, how to manage that temporal authority by primarily working the spiritual authority for the people who she was leading. She combated heresy in a great way, battled the emperors and the kings, as I'd mentioned earlier, for that legitimate role, and worked towards more ably achieving that spiritual and secular authority. However, the 14th century would be a very, very dark period for the church, and we're going to look into that. But before we go too far into that, I wanted to quote what the authors put in their opening paragraph for this chapter. It was authored by Pope St. John Paul II and was delivered in a presentation in 1979. St. John Paul said this: "The first thing I want to offer you is an invitation to optimism, hope, and trust. Certainly, the human race is going through a difficult patch, and we often have painful expressions that the forces of evil have got the upper hand. And yet, we are called to overcome the world by our faith, since we belong to Him who by His death and resurrection has attained for every one of us the victory over sin and death, and so has made us able to affirm humbly, serenely, but certainly that good triumphs over evil." We need to remember that as the foundation of the rest of this presentation. So then, let's start on our road to Avignon. The road to Avignon, the place where the anti-popes ruled for 70 years. It begins with Pope St. Celestine V. When Pope Nicholas IV dies in 1294, rival Italian factions vied for 2 years to find a suitable candidate. And they couldn't, and so in 1294, 3 cardinals nominated an 80-year-old hermit, a saintly hermit who lived in the hills of Abruzzi. His name was Peter Moroni. Pope St. Celestine V was loved by the people, but within a year was overwhelmed by the political machinations within and without the church. The city-states were at battles among each other. The cardinals and the rulers of the church were at battles among themselves. And he was a hermit. He had been a hermit. He did not do a good job at living in that, and within a year, after making some imprudent and ill-informed decisions without precedent in the history of the church, and with great opposition from the members of the hierarchy of the church, he resigned his papacy. And after resigning, he returned to his eremitical lifestyle. I wanted to be a hermit, he says. He goes back to it. However, he was pursued by the new pope, Pope Boniface VIII, such that he would be imprisoned by Boniface VIII, particularly for the last 10 months of his life. And Celestine V lived a very uncomfortable and miserable life those last 10 months, and died imprisoned by Pope Boniface VIII, excuse me. And so Celestine is indeed elevated to the ranks of sainthood. So then, let's now look at his successor, Pope Boniface VIII, and the secular ruler who at the time had the greatest battles, as it were, with him, Philip IV of France. So Boniface VIII, as we mentioned, was pope from 1294 to 1303. He was gifted with political savvy, but very little diplomacy. In fact, during the Jubilee year in 1300, so vain was he that he processed down the streets of Rome wielding a sword in each hand, one in his left to demonstrate his earthly power, and one in his right to demonstrate his worldly power. He was obsessed with being a ruler in both realms. Philip IV, the King of France, who was the grandson of the saintly King Louis IX, shared none of the saints' admiration for the church. And so while Boniface VIII is engaging in his spiritual rule of the church, Philip is attempting to expand his realm in France. And after ascending the throne in 1285, engaged in many, many wars. So by 1296, his coffers had been so completely depleted that he started raiding the church, the monasteries, and all the dioceses in France for additional funds. So much so that Boniface VIII issued a papal bull called Clericis Laicos, stating that the king could not tax the clergy without the permission of the Pope. Philip IV immediately cut off all shipments of gold, silver, or jewels from France to Rome, thereby defeating Boniface VIII. Boniface was brought under the power, as it were, of the French king Philip IV. In 1301, in fact, Philip captured Boniface's papal legate under several trumped-up secular charges, and so Boniface issued another papal bull declaring that all men must submit to the rule of the Pope for the salvation of their souls. Well, Philip called a local council of all the bishops in France, called the Estates Générales, and condemned Pope Boniface VIII for many trumped-up charges, including the murder of Pope St. Celestine V, and the loss of the papal states, the Holy Land, or some of the Holy Land. But the final straw in their relationship came in 1303, when William of Nogaret and Chiara Colonna marched into the papal palace in Anagni in Italy and held Boniface VIII as captive for 3 days. He was significantly mistreated and during that time, but though he was released again in 3 days, he died a short time later of a raging fever. No necessary direct link, but as a result of his mistreatment. So then, that brings us to the final, as it were, piece of the puzzle for the Avignon papacy. So following then Boniface VIII's death, Rome and Italy fell into incredible turmoil. The city-states started to break apart, and any and all of the confederations that had been formed as those city-states tried to join together died. Pope Blessed Benedict XI was elected in October 1303. With some input from Philip IV, who desired to have Boniface VIII condemned, Benedict did not. In fact, he took a step the opposite way. He excommunicated William of Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna, those two men who had mistreated Boniface. But within 8 months of this action, Blessed Benedict XI was found dead. The official cause was listed as acute dysentery. The legend, however, is that he was poisoned by Nogaret. It is indeed a legend. I'm not advocating that's the case, but nonetheless, Benedict XI, within 8 months of not condemning Boniface VIII and excommunicating Nogaret, was indeed found dead. After his death, the chair of Peter remains vacant for nearly a year. Under great pressure from Philip IV, Bertrand de Gaulle, a childhood friend of Philip, is elected the new pope, Clement V. He was elected in June of 1304. Clement V, in order to avoid the political chaos of Rome, chose to set up his papal estate in Avignon. Just as a point of reference, the closest town in Italy, and you'll see that Avignon is that marker on the Google map down in the southeastern portion of France. The closest Italian city is Turin, and it would remain in Avignon for 70 years from this point on. Clement V, though a great friend of Philip IV, refused Philip's demands to condemn Pope Boniface VIII. However, he did yield to Philip IV's requirement to attack the church, as it were, by allowing the Knights Templar in France to be brought to Inquisition. And so the French Inquisition at this time so dissolved the Knights Templar, so brought them to questioning, that it actually destroyed the Templar order. And interestingly enough, Philip IV was able to access half of their possessions. Unfortunately, Clement V, though trying to be honorable, was not able to stop Philip IV's action. Clement V, however, did indeed retract Clericus Laicus and the Unum Sanctum, the two papal bulls that Boniface VIII had issued against Philip IV. So, while in Avignon, Clement V was a great administrator, and so he built up a very strong administrative position for the church in Avignon, so that the church could be ruled well in the wrong place, but nonetheless be ruled well. And it began that whole movement of thinking within the European community that the church was under the thumbs of the French king. And so there was that movement beginning because of Clement V's relationship with Philip IV. So what began to happen is European rulers dismissed the universal rule, the universal nature of Holy Mother Church, and set that sense of regional or state authorized or conciliar order to the church, where local councils had more authority than the authority of Rome. It wasn't fully enfleshed yet, but this process began that thinking. And so there is a heresy called Gallicanism that started its formation here. And Gallicanism is this: it's the movement of the French church that favored the restriction of papal authority over the regional or national churches. It's a movement that, as I've intimated, is going to move through the town and foment great dissent, as we'll see during the Renaissance. In England, while all this is going on in France, between 1351 and 1393, there were laws passed that formed the basis for the development of the Anglican Church. Several hundred years before the Reformation, where that step actually comes to fruition. In Germany, King Louis IV harbored anti-papal agitators in their court, such as William of Ockham, and we'll hear more about William in a few minutes. And in 1324, again, as an additional evidence of this rising sense of revolt and separation between the unitive sense of the church universally throughout the world versus the national churches, Marsiglio of Padua wrote Defensor Pacis, which was a definitive assertion that the secular rulers had supremacy over the church as opposed to the papacy. So, while in Avignon, that sense of rebellion, that sense of revolt, the independence of the papacy was being diminished, and it begins with Clement V. So this is going on. Enter the Black Plague. Now, stepping back for a moment, the 13th century had brought great wealth and prosperity to Europe. Large cities grew and were replacing what had been primarily an agrarian culture. And it was drawing record numbers of people to the center of town, where goods now no longer became the currency, but money did. And so wealth was being accumulated. And the added wealth, as it does in every case, increased life expectancy, but it forced a greater dependence on smaller areas of agricultural production. So by the beginning of the 14th century, this model was starting to show signs of weakness. So then, let's look at famine and the Black Death. A large-scale famine broke out in Europe between 1315 and 1317. Again, as intimated before, with increasing city populations, the decline as cities grew larger, arable land decreased, and the arable land that was available became less fruitful. So productivity dropped, as you might expect, and so less and less food was available. Again, farmers would be leaving their land to move to the city to pursue the idea of wealth versus goods. This sets up overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and so on and so forth, so that now we're in city centers with large blocks of people. So then famine establishes food supply, improper nutrition, and so on and so forth, that goes with a diminished food supply. When something like the Black Death breaks in, it can wreak incredible havoc. So let's look at the Black Death. It first broke out in Europe in the Genoese Black Sea trading post of Kaffa. And if you look at Kaffa, if you look right up here in this little peninsula, you'll see the town of Sevastopol, current Sevastopol. That's Kaffa in the time in 1315. So the Genoese sailors would sail through the Black Sea and up to Genoa, and were incredibly rich traders. So in 1347, the Genoese sailors brought back the Black Death to Genoa, and it incredibly and rapidly spread throughout Europe. The first outbreak in 1347 lasted until 1351. The Black Plague, or the bubonic plague, repeated its presence every 10 years or so until the 18th century, as immunity cannot be transmitted through the generations. The text intimated that it's estimated that 25 million people, fully 1/3 of the population of Europe, perished by this disease. It's called the bubonic plague, and it's characterized in three forms. It's literally an inflammation of the lymph glands to the size of eggs, which cause a pooling of blood in the surrounding vessels and causes large black splotches, hence the name the Black Death. It can be transmitted in three ways. Flea bites from the small rats who would carry it, with a mortality rate at the time of 50%. The second method was the pneumonic mutation, where sputum and bodily fluids through sneezes or coughs could directly affect another. The mortality rate of this form was 95%. And the third method was the septicemic method, that is a contact with blood. So when direct contact with a person's blood, the caretaker would contract the disease, and the mortality rate was 95%. Why do I bring that up? It's not hard, by understanding this modality of how this disease progresses, how that can affect, what devastating effects this has in a city, what effects it has on the spiritual, moral, psychological, familial, and every other relationship in your life in this period of time. And in fact, it caused the second the second Avignon Pope, Clement VI, who reigned 1342 to 1352, to consecrate the Rhone River in Avignon so that the dead who were cast into the river might receive the last rites. So there weren't any more priests to provide the sacraments. A horrific event going on simultaneously. If you're interested, Petrarch and Giovanni Boccaccio survived the Black Plague in Italy to write about it, and their descriptions are rather stark and dark, and they capture the conditions of the circumstances of the Black Plague. Just as a back note here, the Black Plague came from somewhere. It was brought by the Tartars to Kaffa from China, where it destroyed half the population of China. So the entire European and Asiatic continent was embroiled in this horribly destructive disease. Couple that with the 100 Years' War. So, stepping back for a second, during the Avignon papal residence, the 100 Years' War begins in 1357 and intermittently lasts through 1453. The church had laid the foundation through that 13th century in her universal role that the European leaders were of the same family, and that we were all of the same nation. We were bonded in a commonality, and that commonality came to be known as the peace and truce of God. With the apparent nationalization of the papacy in Avignon, that bond was ultimately destroyed. That sense of universality of the nations was decimated, and so then it gave rise to independent monarchs, independently running their nations without consideration of the nations surrounding them. And so we see, let's look at some of the effects of that. Let's look at first the English and the French relationship. If you remember, most of you probably don't, as I did not, I was reminded from the time of William the Conqueror in the 11th century to the middle 1300s, the English and French crowns were interrelated by numerous matrimonial alliances. French owned land in England, England owned land in France due to these relationships. Henry II, for example, his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine yielded to the English a huge, the huge area of the Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France, down in this area here. However, the French didn't see it that way. The French saw the English as vassals. They were merely caretakers for the French of that land by virtue of their relationship with the French. However, the French supported the rebellious nobles of Scotland, and they were supporting the rebellion in Scotland for those people who wanted their own independence. So enter Flanders, modern-day Belgium, an area disputed by both France and England. The English were in great need of the Flemish people because they were weavers of textile, and their textile world, their textile capacity was huge, and they used English wool. And so Edward III, then king, put Flanders under the crown of England's protection, thereby enraging the French monarchy. So with some of this background going on, in 1328, Charles V, the last son of Philip IV, dies without an heir. So the Capetian line in France ends. Philip of Valois, the nephew of Philip IV, assumed the French monarchy, but Edward III, whose mother was sister of Charles IV, asserted the right of succession. So thus begins the 100-Year War. So, the war itself was really a series of battles with periods of relative peace in between. However, the English grab an early lead at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Crécy is up here around Amiens, not too far from Flanders. A very small English force decidedly defeats the French at Crécy with the introduction of a new weapon, the longbow. In 1356, Edward III's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, leads an offensive at Poitiers to extend their area of occupation. But it's a bloody battle, and they battle on, but the peace only lasts for a few years, into 1360, when the hostilities resume. The French, having learned from Crécy, entered into a guerrilla type of warfare and battled for 20-some years of grueling and deadly warfare. So at the end of this 20 years, by 1380, with Edward III and Edward the Black Prince both dead, England only holding Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Calais, Charles VI, as King of France, assumes the throne at age 12. Besides being young, he was notably mad. This prompted an internal conflict within the houses of France, resulting in a weakened national resolve. So Henry V, the English king, destroys the French aristocracy at Agincourt in 1415 and overwhelms the king and assumes the throne of France by marrying Catherine, the king's daughter. A succession of young and incompetent and partially mad king leaves France subject to the English throne. So we're around 1410, 1415. St. Joan of Arc enters the world in 1412, but at the age of 13, here's St. Michael the Archangel, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine of Alexandria calling her to be the liberator of France, and in particular, the city of Orléans. In May 1429, after finally convincing Charles VII, now King of France, that she would lead him to his rightful coronation, he allows her to muster an army and led a small force against the English at Orléans, thereby freeing the regions of Loire, Troyes, and Chalon, where they were set free. St. Joan was wounded, but insisted on pressing on to Reims. Reims is up here in this section to the northeast of Paris, which is right down here. In July 1429, St. Joan's army captures Reims, where Charles VII is finally crowned King Charles VII of France and had met her primary objective. King Charles, however, and his court grew increasingly apathetic to Joan and essentially dismissed her. In 1430, she engaged the English at Compiègne and was captured, and King Charles eventually abandoned her and did nothing to offer her any solace or relief. And ultimately, by Bishop Pierre Cochon of Beauvais, yeah, I know, was, for those of you who are French, you caught that, huh? It is, it's C-A-U-C-H-O-N. Anyway, Bishop Pierre of Beauvais has her burned at the stake in May of 1431. Further history with St. Joan. In 1456, Pope Callistus III lifts that sentence, and in 1909 she was beatified, in 1920 canonized by Pope Benedict XV. But St. Joan's legacy more immediately in her time galvanized the French, and it turned the tide of the war. Through small but deliberate skirmishes, the French gradually regained their country, so that by 1453, the English would only control Calais. St. Joan became that symbol of French unity and nationality at the close of the 100-Year War. So, we see what's going on in England and France in their relationship, mostly what was going on in France. Let's look then at the return to Rome and the schism that introduced. So the last of the Avignon popes, Pierre Roger de Beaufort, was elected the seventh and last of the Avignon popes in December of 1370. He would reign until March 1378, but his reign would end in the throne of Peter in Rome. Stepping back for a moment, increasingly during the reign, Pierre Roger de Beaufort was elected Gregory XI. During the reign of Gregory XI, Avignon was in the midst of the 100-Year War and was seeing the war find its way closer and closer to Avignon. So, war in Avignon, war in Rome. War in Avignon, war in Rome. Where do you run? So much so that Gregory XI is interested in returning to Rome. He knows in his heart that the seat of Peter belongs there. While this is going on, St. Catherine of Siena is introduced into the world in 1347. She's born as the youngest of 25 children. At the age of 7, she consecrates her virginity to Christ, and she begins to have visions of Christ and consecrates herself to serve the church. At 16, she joins the Dominican tertiaries, and for the next 3 years lives a very secluded and demanding ascetical life. And about at the end of this time, she's spiritually espoused to Christ, which means that Christ personally takes her as his bride, which was witnessed by the Blessed Virgin and a myriad of saints. It is a state in which the soul is infused with great charity and a great and deep familiarity with God. Catherine, from there on, undertakes the role of serving the poor in the most abject poverty and lived with those she served. She suffers constant pain and often survives long periods of her life on the Eucharist alone. During this time, it is recorded by her sisters that she is radiantly happy, filled with practical wisdom and great spiritual insight. She exudes such personal charm that even in the face of physical suffering, members of her own order would tease her about it. They would harass her and harangue her, and it didn't bother her. And she was joyful about it. All her life it is recorded that she would continue to have visions, and in fact at one point has visions of hell, purgatory, and heaven. And you can find that incredible story of her life in the dialogue. It is a heady but incredible read. I couldn't encourage it more highly. However, during this time of vision, she was instructed to heal the wounds of the church. So in 1374, she begins to take an active role in that resolution by writing letters to secular leaders and ecclesial leaders. And in fact, she began writing to Gregory XI. In June of 1376, so much so had her relationship with Gregory XI developed that she made a trip to Avignon to meet with Pope Gregory, during which she reminded him of a vow he had taken when he accepted the crown of Peter. And that vow was that he would return the crown of Peter to Rome. He had never spoken a word to anyone about this. And so Gregory XI knew and was more richly emboldened to bring the papacy back to Rome by virtue of St. Catherine's direct interface and reminder and encouragement of that return. In fact, she became one of his great encouragers. So that in January of 1377, Gregory XI returns the chair of St. Peter. However, before he does that, he sends Catherine of Siena to Florence in an attempt to help quell the revolt that's going on between Florence and Rome, the wars going on, such that Catherine of Siena is almost murdered in her efforts to bridge the peace. She isn't quite yet, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the story, but Gregory XI sends Catherine as an emissary to attempt to bring additional peace. So Gregory XI returns the chair in January of 1377. Catherine of Siena retires to Siena, where she dictates the dialogue. However, the chaos in Italy continues, and Gregory XI dies in March of 1378 in Rome on the throne of Peter. In November of 1378, the new Pope Urban VI summons Catherine to Rome for her advice in dealing with the Great Western Schism, which is about to happen. She suffers great physical pains and, in fact, receives the stigmata while in Rome on this call by Pope Urban VI. And after a life of prolonged agony, she dies on April 29, 1380, at the age of 33, at which point the stigmata was revealed. In 1430, her body was unearthed and found incorrupt, and she was canonized in 1461. Her relics are still the object of pilgrimage to this day at Santa Maria sopra Minerva, near the Pantheon. So let's step back for a moment now that we've kind of tied up St. Catherine's life to the Western Schism. So Gregory XI dies on his return to Rome. The Archbishop of Bari, Bartolomeo Pregnano, Pope Urban VI is elected, in April of 1378. I said earlier it was November, but it is actually in April of 1378. Most in the College of Cardinals at the time thought that they had elected a docile and malleable leader. Well, you know what happens when that's thought. He was the polar opposite. Urban VI declared war on every moral abuse. He harshly criticized the materialistic ways of the worldly bishops and cardinals. He was overzealous in demanding changes, immediate changes, and he was violent in his demeanor. And in fact, when St. Catherine met him, she advised him to moderate his violent tendencies, but he would not take her advice. She did work to mediate on his behalf, however, he was his own worst enemy. 6 months later, in October of 1378, the French bishops returned to Avignon and denounce Urban VI's election, and they elect Robert of Geneva, anti-pope Clement VII, who would reign in Avignon. So now new heresies grow in the face of this schism. As we talked about Gallicanism, Conciliarism, which we'll talk about a bit, Wycliffism, and Hussitism began to grow. More heresies are introduced by this great confusion in the church. So the Western Schism continues, comes to its resolution in 1400 at the Council of Constance. The anti-popes continue to be elected. the Pope continued to be elected. Conciliarism brews, which is a belief that a general council of the church has authority over the Pope's rule in the church. A council has authority over the Pope, not that the Pope has ultimate authority and thereby authority over a council. And so with the idea of conciliarism, in 1400, that no resolution, the Council of Constance comes about in 1409. That's wrong also. The first attempt to overcome this confusion with the anti-popes in Avignon occurs in Pisa in Italy in 1409, where a council was called, a local council, that Gregory XII, the legitimate pope, and Benedict XIII, the anti-pope, did not recognize the election of the second anti-pope, Alexander V. So we're going to call him the Pisan anti-pope. Yeah, it's confusing. It really is. So Gregory XII, the legitimate pope, Benedict XIII, the anti-pope, and then at this council in 1409 in Pisa, another anti-pope called the Pisan anti-pope, Alexander V, is elected. The Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, recognizes the insanity of this all and forces Pisan anti-pope John the 23rd, the second and last of the anti-popes, in 1414 to call the Council of Constance. Finally getting to the Council of Constance. It was called in modern day, it's in Liechtenstein, modern day Liechtenstein. It was then in Germany, and the council lasted from 1414 to 1418. Pope Gregory XII, the legitimate pope, agreed to send a legate to the council, thereby making it legitimate, with two provisos. The first proviso, Gregory XII must be recognized as the legitimate pope, and that he would abdicate upon the election of a single pope, who would then be his successor. Well, as you might expect, anti-pope Benedict XIII refused to participate in the council, thereby losing almost all of his support in the world. Benedict XIII, remember, was ruling in Avignon. The outcome of the Council of Constance in November of 1417, Otto Colonia was elected Martin V, Pope of the Church. Benedict XIII would not agree to this and continued to live his life as anti-pope in Avignon, recognized by no one. Anti-pope John the 23rd, the Pisan anti-pope, recognized Martin V, thereby ending this mire, this disaster in the leadership roles of the church. It was at the Council of Constance as well that three specific conditions were established to develop the criteria for a valid ecumenical council. First, it must be called by a pope. Second, it must be attended by a pope or his legate. And finally, it must be ratified by the pope. Now, the Council of Constance indeed resolved the immediate problem of three popes, but it did not resolve the great harm caused to the church and its credibility. As a quick aside, they did note that Benedict XIII, anti-pope Benedict XIII, would spend the rest of his life in Papal Ilucas, Spain, some 40 miles southwest of Zaragoza. So he even left Avignon. During this time, we then also see a decline of scholastic philosophy and theology and a rise in heresy. As a guiding light, the church had fallen in its apparent role. Available knowledge had increased. The secular realm had lost its power over people, and social mores had floundered. People and thinkers began to question authority. Familiar? What was always known as truth was doubted and challenged. Thinking was overtaking revelation. The formal process of philosophy and theology was being replaced with the advance of individual thought and its supremacy over cumulative knowledge. Enter William of Ockham. He lives 1287 to 1347. He's an English Franciscan friar and a scholastic philosopher. You've heard of Occam's razor, perhaps. It states that among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. Translated, the simplest answer is probably the most correct. You've heard it translated that way. William of Ockham took as his philosophical foundation, I believe in God, the Father, the Almighty. That's it. All of the rest of his theology was based on that. I believe God, the Father, the Almighty. He believed that the Father is the direct and only reason that things are true and false. He believed that only sensible things, items that I can experience with my five senses, are those that I can know. For example, the textbook that I used for this talk, I can know. But the idea of a textbook, I can't know. I can know the textbook, but not the idea of it. The name is simply an idea. It doesn't state an objective reality. So then, when you get into that idea of thinking, it leads to, and in our case, looking at the moral sense, it leads to the idea that a moral truth derived from reason is really not accessible to us. That we can only know a universal truth from direct revelation, which leads to the ideas that actions cannot be judged as good or bad by their nature, but must be explicitly revealed to us by God as such. In tangible terms, fetal stem research. We could never know that that is illicit because it's by reason that we deduce it unless God the Father would have revealed it to us directly. His thinking would found a movement that questioned the church's authority on matters of the empirical, of the state, and of the world. It's a foundational thinking that was incredibly destructive. Let's look at John Wycliffe. He lived 1320 to 1384. He was a professor at Oxford, and he saw the effects of the 100 Years' War. He saw the effects of the Avignon papacy, and he saw the wealth and abuse of clerical authority that was legitimately present in the secular realm. He said the church should rid itself of all political authority, temporal wealth, and material possessions. The church should live in abject poverty, and any cleric who owned anything lived in sin. He said that belief in the Bible alone was sufficient. Church tradition did not contribute to religious knowledge. He believed in predestination. And from what he believed, it followed that the king could confiscate church holdings. Certainly convenient for a king to support his war. But since we are destined for salvation or not, predestined, what is the purpose of the church, one might argue? What is the purpose of priesthood? What is the purpose of the sacraments? If predestination is true, then it doesn't matter what we do. That later in life, many of the nobles and the kings would realize how awful this thought would be. What would be the need of a secular government? What would be the need of X if God has already determined our destiny? Predestination. Wycliffe brought that into the thinking. One last person to look at, Han Hus. He lived in 1339 to 1415. He was the rector of the University of Prague, and he adopted many of Wycliffe's ideas. and he sought single-handedly to reform the church in Bohemia. He believed private judgment prevailed over church, private and free interpretation of the Bible, denied the authority of tradition, denied the efficacy of the veneration of relics, rejected the existence of purgatory, rejected the sacraments, denied transubstantiation, and faith alone is the means of salvation. He had been excommunicated by the church because he remained as a member of the Catholic Church and professed Catholicity. But he was given the opportunity to recant that at the Council of Constance. Having been excommunicated by the church, he was brought to the council to be tried on heresy. He was tried there, would not recant, and finally burned at the stake in 1415. He was seen as a Czech martyr, and as a result of his death, churches and priests were killed in the Hussite War in Bohemia. So what does all of this bring to us? What do we conclude? First of all, that the authentic papacy has an effect on all aspects of human existence. Secondly, the authentic papacy, ruled in the power of the Holy Spirit, with holy men wearing the crown, are essential to the church, which affects the health of the social structure. Thirdly, in spite of an unhealthy papacy or unholy popes, the church is still present today. And so we know with absolute certainty that the gates of hell shall not prevail. We found that the 13th and 14th centuries laid the groundwork to Martin Luther and his great revolt. We know that the church must face great changes as man changes. As knowledge of the world grows, we must as a church grow in our knowledge of the world, but figure out how it fits into the reality that is God. Because nothing of what we're uncovering today or in any time is not known to God. What we must do is integrate that into the temporal, philosophical, and theological understandings of what it is we are and know, and make that our metaphysical belief. The root problems of today are no different than the past, and so we must ask ourselves, who do you turn to know the truth? Thank you. Sorry it was so long.
Qui tollis peccatum